Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new episode of the In Production podcast. Today, we have an amazing guest. John, please tell us more about yourself and why should people listen?
Hi, everybody. John Cornetta here, 30-year practitioner in procurement. Started my career in telecommunications. Found myself in a business reengineering role where the first thing we reengineered was really how that company in telecommunications procured network technology. Hadn't been in place
Mm,
before. Really whet my appetite for the value proposition that procurement brings to an organization, and chose to stay in that field for my entire career, just moving across industries and expanding the depth and breadth of my experience and categories.
it's called. We're going to cover each one of those episodes. I'm going to have a lot of questions about learnings that you got from different industries. But the first one, let's focus on your latest industry and your latest work, because you wrote publicly that AI won't fix a broken procurement model. And that's obvious for some people. For some folks, it's not really obvious. I would love to ask you about your time. So since you joined the Valley Bank in 2023, the same year, they finished the core banking system overhaul and were sitting under real regulatory pressure. So when you join a new company in a highly regulated industry, what would you as a procurement leader would advise to look first at? To what kind of skeletons you first recommend to find?
I think it's important for any new opportunity to step back and have a little bit of patience in understanding the business and how it operates and where those sacred cows might exist, right? So I was fortunate to be able to meet with a lot of our C-suite at Valley, and honestly had fantastic conversations. Open books, open kimono in terms of practices what I felt was a genuine expressed interest in what value I could bring to the business and doing things differently,
Mhm.
eating things, etc. So that was a very nice welcome and a very positive launch to my time at Valley.
Interesting. So usually when you land in procurement, sometimes the function doesn't exist and you have to build it from scratch. Sometimes you land in a department and you see that there's a lot of areas for improvement. Sometimes you see that the department was working great, but now y- the company is planning to go to a different stage. So you need to implement the changes into the procurement department that is counting on you and your leadership or on your vision. What would you recommend for the viewers or listeners? Where to focus in the first 6 months?
Well, I think if those initial conversations should reveal the business priorities and what areas of opportunity the leadership that's been there
Hmm.
and need help with, because you're going to need to build credibility. So finding out what those priorities are, and maybe they're not the I don't want to say maybe they are low hanging fruit. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're more administrative, transactional in nature. But I think it's important to embrace that, just to build that credibility and build that relationships. You don't want to waste too much time, but you don't want to spend too much time doing that, because obviously there's a bigger opportunity to seize. In parallel to that, what you need to do is assess three things typically: people, processes, and systems.
Hmm.
What's the skill set of the team that you may or may not be inheriting or you need to build? What processes, what controls exist, and overlaying, you can begin to formulate thoughts about what controls need to be put in place.
Hmm.
What's your infrastructure look like, and how does it support those other two elements? So, I typically go in with my eyes wide open, primarily to those three things, and seizing the opportunities that I can to build credibility with business partners, and you launch from there. That's typically your 30, 60, 90-day plan.
How are you thinking about the vendor risk? Because you've been in multiple various industries in the past. So what were the learnings that you kind of got from hospitality, financial services, apparel that you brought with yourself into banking when you're thinking about
Yeah.
that?
So I've had the opportunity to work across several different industries. I mentioned telecommunications, and first third, you have apparel and fashion, digital education, and then primarily also financial services
Hmm.
with different firms, and also working from a consulting perspective and an in-house perspective. So I've been able to see quite a different landscape. And I go into the conversation saying, procurement is about pulling levers. It's identifying levers and pulling the right levers, right? So in
Hmm.
different cultures. The levers are usually the same, but how far you pull them is the difference, right? And so in the financial services industry, obviously you've got regulatory oversight from the OCC, SEC, FINRA
Hmm.
that apply, and you need to lean into that risk lever quite a bit, right? And build strong capabilities around assessing supplier risk and documenting controls and managing controls in your business processes.
Procurement sometimes can be a double-edged sword because at the same time as it protects the company, it may also reveal a lot of inefficiencies that are inside of the company. And I would love to learn an advice from you for leaders that are in the same in procurement right now. How, because you've been also writing about this, that the C-suite misses a lot of value in digitalizing the procurement, because when you digitalize the procurement, you can see more and you can subtly expose bad buying behaviors. You can see the problems that you already have in your own organization, kind of like the hard truth that is very hard to break for yourself. So
Right.
what would you recommend for leaders? How would you deal with that kind of internal pressure where you have to navigate those hard topics to say, okay, like we're going to digitalize this and we're going to see a lot of problems, but that's okay. How do you usually navigate those conversations, and what kind of risk that puts you into having
The
those kind of conversations?
professional personal risk in those situations. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that is probably very timely. I mentioned earlier about the C-suite and interviewing, and those conversations, 90% of them were very welcoming. And I remember the president of the company putting off the CEO of the company because we were having a conversation, and he said, "Yeah, I'll call him later. I'm meeting with John. I want to talk to him more."
Hmm. Hmm.
Which was great validation. Conversely, there were individuals that maybe aren't used to working with procurement, or individuals that suggest they were procurement and know better. But in that case, it's like, hey man, I'm excited to lean in. I'm excited to have another perspective to help me set the priorities and the execution. And you also have a competing. I think what I encountered was you had competing priorities, right?
Hmm.
So my reporting structure was into the CFO, and his mandate was people, processes, and systems, exactly what I had said earlier. So that was great alignment. But others had different thoughts. And I think you can only be true to yourself. I think that, particularly coming at it with the experience I have, you've got to deal in facts and data.
Hmm.
You've got to be transparent. You've got to lay the chips out on the table and say, these are the things and these are the conclusions I draw from them and these are my recommendations. And then at the end of the day, if it's not your decision to make, if it's for executives to make, you facilitate that decision. But at least it's clearly documented where you stand and what you saw and what you thought of the priorities to do.
That's great, because I guess it's like a deal with the devil where you actually know what needs to be done, but you still avoid it because, to not hurt anybody's priorities or ego or whatever. I imagine that this kind of thing just stays with you, and then it has an impact on your whole career and the way that you work.
You've got to be true to yourself, right? And listen, there's always an opportunity to learn and adjust your
Hmm.
style. And it's one thing that I personally am always seeking that out. Okay. Let me hear the constructive feedback, the challenges. I think I push for that more than I do the praise. But at the end of the day, it is, like I said, there's a style to manage that, right? It's about being factual, about facts and data, presenting them on the table, the risks, the costs, and if you haven't convinced the leadership that ultimately gets to make that decision, it's okay. Let's move forward. Let's support it. And that was a real example of what I encountered in those first 6 months. After working on the source to pay proposal, it did not get approved by our leadership.
Hmm.
I'll save it for a private conversation. It was an interesting dynamic to watch the C-suite argue that out. But at the end of the day, there was an ask for me to go away and do, and I accomplished that.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I didn't let that initial no or resistance stop me from progressing where I could.
Hmm.
And there were ancillary asks by the C-suite for me to focus in on different areas, which actually were part of the bigger puzzle. So I was able to take that initial source to pay business case,
Hmm.
and even though I didn't get approval to do a big bang, I was able to build most of it over the last 2 years, knocking out quite a bit of it and putting the controls in that we needed ostensibly. And to be candid, I'm not sure with that
Hmm.
back, but ostensibly one of the most important pieces was still not accomplished of source to pay to complete the project. But we knocked out three of the five or three of the four pieces and left it.
Very interesting, because we looked at it from the lens of getting approval initially for the project that you have in mind. And I want to ask you a little bit tougher version of the question that I was initially intending on. So let's say if you are a procurement leader in a very highly regulated industry, it can be banking, it can be anything else like healthcare or something else. Let's say you have a great, beautiful governance framework. You have an amazing project. You got the sign off, everything now should start rolling. But then you suddenly see that employees, they start finding workarounds for the things that you have created.
Right.
Or maybe they follow the process, but let's say two experienced people with the same kind of data will make different decisions.
Hmm.
And how do you work around those decisions? How do you work around those places where the governance framework or the model that you have created meets the real way that people have been doing this process, or the experience that the amount of context that an experienced claim processor has in 10 years is like huge. So they can really work around and find any way to comply or not comply with the governance frameworks that you get brought to them. So how are you thinking? How are you feeling about those kind of gray areas? And what kind of levels of control you still have on, I think enforcing is a bad word, but
Course, no,
yeah.
that goes back early in my career, exactly that issue, right? We had data available to us on who was bypassing our procurement platform. And in my role, I had a certain relationship ownership for various business decisions. It was ironic enough that the individual had been a former mentor of mine in my college days. He had started his career with AT&T and was a mentor during my internship. So that was an easy conversation. And what you typically find out is that, majority of people don't know. Even fast forwarding it to my most recent experience, I one of the things in trying to gather the facts and datas and how we're going to operate was looking for what controls around contracts authority we have, right? And you expect, particularly within a financial services institution, that they're going to have clearly documented rules and responsibilities there.
Hmm.
And so I was facilitating that because our process took through contract negotiation. So then, myself and my team were facilitating. But what was apparent to me is so many people across the organization, 100-year-old company, didn't know these things even existed. And it was clearly documented as far back as 2014 that these existed.
Hmm.
The risk person I was interfacing with at the time would tell me, well, we don't want to make them so public because people will use that to possibly commit fraud. And I thought that's kind of curious. Like, well, people aren't committing fraud. Let's say that, but they don't know, so they're not following them. And I can
Hmm.
give and provided documented evidence in large part. And the authority, as I saw among the other C-suite, was at the chief marketing officer level. But guess what? Her name wasn't on that list of authorized contract signers. And when I went to her with that, I was like, I don't even know this exists. We
Hmm.
had in our CFO, the new CFO, who actually was a former finance person within the organization. He had no knowledge of this authority table. Yeah. So I'm sorry, your question goes back to, how do you manage the maverick spend? How do you put those controls in place? And I was going to a place of where I think sometimes it's about the communication. People just don't know.
Hmm.
Making sure that they're aware. And particularly with an initial transformation, you're gonna have that, right? So you're covering as much as you can. You're targeting your spend from top down, trying to get to that, 20% of the suppliers, that 80% of the spend,
Hmm.
but then cleaning up the rest over time and cleaning it up with a tool, if you've done this successfully, that helps to make things more efficient. Not just making sure the controls are in place, but makes the process for those people easy to manage, easy to get their products, goods, and services, quickly, and then also, making it easier on the back end, accruals and finance and posting and all those things.
Hmm.
That's how you'll build kind of credibility and endorsement of the transformation.
Very interesting. And you also mentioned that, I mean, at the end of the day, you're having an impact on the cost. On your LinkedIn, you roll that you have around 15 million annually in annual cost and efficiency opportunities at Valley. What of your experience can be generalized um, to say, hey, folks, if you want to go and get similar kind of results, like if you want to have a real impact in terms of finding good efficiency opportunities that will impact your cost ratio, better do this, this, and this.
Mhm. So how do I educate others on how they can get similar results?
Exactly. Like what can, because if you can share details, please do. But at the end of the day, yeah, what can be generalist?
And I'd love to say I have the copyright and the patent and everything else on it. Think it is well. Your greatest lever is always going to be competition.
Hmm.
So the ability to introduce competition, and that's where if we get into the conversation and how we initially met about AI and procurement, that's where I think AI blew my mind in terms of the capability it now gives us in terms of market research and
Hmm.
finding competitors to products and solutions, right? So typically, I'm going to say hazard a guess of 80% of your demand comes from just the renewal cycle, right? So go back to our start of the conversation. How to get that pipeline? Think about it, right? Those are contracts that you hope have been working well, that were done cost effectively if you weren't there on the front end,
Hmm.
and but as a practitioner that over time there has been scope creep, there has been margin, eroded, and so those deals weren't as good as you did them initially.
Yeah.
CPI index, whatever it might be. So, having visibility into it and then being able to say to, now remember, these guys that you're working with in the IT department, that's their thing. That's their domain. They're the experts. They probably have a deeper understanding of the marketplace than you do. Certainly me, at my more elevated level. AI now gives you the ability to just very quickly, something that used to be laborious to do, and way back when we used to have books on a shelf that we would go to that you would use as a reference guide to find suppliers.
Hmm.
Now it's just so much easier to get access to that information. You don't even need listen, there's a whole lot of separate topic on like the impact of AI on like market tools, et cetera. But I find it even more accessible to simply use your enterprise version of ChatGPT and say, find me competitors to this product or service. And then from there, take that data, give me the independent research, the Gartner assessment, et cetera, to help, frame my category knowledge that I can then take.
Hmm.
I be doing that before you have the first conversation with the business. Go get this knowledge and build this base so that you can talk more credibly to your business counterpart. Take your contract, load your contract into ChatGPT or whatever your enterprise version is, have it identify the risks of that current contract, develop a negotiation framework for you. I mean, there's just so many capabilities that I think are now available to us in just the last 12 18 months
Hmm.
that are really going to, I don't know that it challenges the staffing, the structure, but it definitely allows you to do a lot more and deeper than previously. I know that's exactly. I'm the type of leader in a department that I don't like to just ask somebody to go do it. I
Hmm.
like to know what I'm asking them to do. So hands on in that respect, like I've in my most recent and before that led some of the more strategic initiatives in our department. And I think it's important to be able to speak from that experience and not just from experience 20 years ago, because as we say, like AI coming on the
Changed everything. Yeah.
changes everything, and it's just going to continue to do it faster, do it more effectively, and figuring out how we can best leverage that is going to be so critical to our credibility and to our success in the procurement space.
Now, I'm very curious on your perspective about AI in procurement. So, what do you think is the most dangerous thing that a financial institution can do when they deploy AI in procurement, but let's say they don't have data and process discipline?
Yeah. So I talked about it more as like market access, right? So market
Hmm.
research on competitors and stuff. I did mention putting contracts and asking it to analyze and identifying risks within existing contracts and suggesting KPIs and SLAs that we should be the challenge. And back to the most recent example where I did not get the procure to pay component of source to pay in place. The data and what I've been, as you mentioned, what I've been writing about is that if you don't have the line item visibility available to you, if you don't have that accurate data,
Hmm.
AI is only as good as what you put into it. And that's not just an AI issue. That's been the historical thing. You know, crap in, crap out. Pardon me.
Exactly. Yeah. And but just with AI, it's going to be more crap, significantly more.
Yeah, yeah, and that's gonna as it build, as these large language models build and they're seeing this information, does that then affect the credibility of the feedback we're getting? Now, my position on it, AI isn't the end. It's not the decision. It's the input. The
Hmm.
humans need to evaluate that as if you would have a conversation with me or somebody else from your team, and you position something and you get their input and they're like, you know what, that's a good point, but I don't know about that. I mean, you're still gonna need to own that decision making.
Hmm.
And so I think the risk with AI, in particular, is you got to get your data right. If you're going in that direction to help you with the spend analytics piece of it, you need the depth of the data, which is the line item detail. And to be able to tell you, I just one quick anecdote. I had this conversation. It was part of that source to pay business case. And I said to one executive in the room, I said, right now you have 4 managers from your organization actually culling through invoices to be able to segment the spend with a particular supplier we were looking to do an initiative with.
Hmm.
4 senior managers, probably making well over 200,000 each. We're spending at least most of the holidays culling through this data, which if you have access to that line item detail within a spend analytics application, should be available at your fingertips.
Crazy.
Seemed crazy to me, uh, but what are you going to do?
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of institutions right now, mid-sized banks, different financial institutions, insurance teams that are thinking, wow, how do we use AI to be more efficient? How do we use AI to uncover those bottlenecks that you just mentioned? Because those small little stupid things that actually drain a lot of resources.
Yeah,
So they go and they hire the first AI-driven procurement leader. They want him to go and change the way that they're operating, implement the AI-driven sourcing of the new vendors, checking for the existing vendors and renewals, as you mentioned. Most of the organization, they either have fragmented systems that have been existing from, I don't know, from the dinosaur area, that have been all over the place. Some organizations, they have very limited spending, because a transformation can be costly very fast. There can be a bottleneck in compliance team, because compliance team doesn't want to touch anything with AI because it doesn't understand how it's going to impact their business. Maybe they're afraid of any leaks, and the company cannot really afford like a big four consultant.
mhm.
So they know that they want to do something. They realize their limitations. They hire a new leader in the procurement that is supposed to bring all this AI innovation. What would you, so like in the previous question, you kind of said about data. Would you recommend them the first thing that they do in their position to focus on making their data good and right quality for enabling any kind of transformation? Or would you extend that, or would you give any other advice for them to really do it first?
I would say you can follow multiple paths here. Like I mentioned earlier, people, processes, and systems, but let's extend it a little bit. I mean, so when I first started, it's about meeting with the C-suite, understanding their priorities, and knowing, hey, the CFO wants assistance with this small agreement for board software that has significant exposure. So sure, let me help with that. Maybe it's not within the policy for me to have a focus on that, but let me help you with that, build some credibility. Again, it's about you're going to need to navigate a few things in parallel, right? So I
Hmm.
think fundamentally, absolutely, one of them is getting your data in an accurate and accessible place. At the same time, that shouldn't limit you or stop you from looking at well, part of your data is your renewal data, looking at the upcoming deals, because you're going to need to build credibility and build potentially goodwill with business partners. So you're going to need to also focus on those in doing the best with what you have.
Hmm.
But so So in my mind, you've really got to address, on different levels. But absolutely one of them should be, and in hindsight, sometimes you learn this, but it should be about pushing for that visibility at a line item. Because like as I say, with this one agreement we
Hmm.
have, we purchased multiple things with them, and we were looking at a segment of that relationship, not the total relationship, but we didn't have visibility into that spend because we didn't have line item visibility into our data.
Right now is a great time because so many organizations are making these innovation projects with the purpose for changing themselves, changing their own business. So I would like to close the episode with talking with you a little bit about the future. So, how do you see the procurement function? Because ultimately, the procurement function, if it brings so much value that it should be like on the strategic table. It should be a part of the strategic table in every strategic, and maybe even tactical decision. Because procurement is essentially building the rails, how the whole organization is functioning. So, with all this innovation, what is your vision? How would the procurement department look like in 5 years that is actually doing his job, the one that is efficient? And that's kind of like the ideal picture scenario. And how do you think the whole evolution of the procurement function would probably happen?
There's a couple of things that went through my head as you laying out the question. One of the things I see in a lot of leadership seminars that are being offered or asked to attend or speak at are about getting a seat at the table. We've also been always been seeking a seat at the table, um, with the C-suite. So I don't know that I don't know that if that's it, I don't want to say is relevant. So let's keep this in context. It's still important to have that visibility. I guess what I'm getting at is a lot of the same challenges seem to still be there.
Hmm.
I think the advantage that AI gives is what we talked about in terms of a best in class procurement organization, category management expertise, the execution, sourcing tools, et cetera. I think that AI is really going to help us in those spaces in the initial. I
Hmm.
know a lot of work being done to help, with generative AI and managing purchase orders and things like that and intake and orchestration. But I think, what's interesting, and I don't know how this is going to play. I feel like in some respects, there's a lot of us that have been walking around in procurement happy to be transactional in nature.
Mm.
And I don't think that that works anymore. It shouldn't have worked 10 years ago. You've got to be more strategic and focused. And I think that's where AI plays into it. And that's where I was very, I think, aggressively, very, what's the word? Evangelically, sorry, talking with my team about look at the capabilities we now have at our fingertips. So you don't need to ask the business what they want to do with this renewal. You can position what we should be doing with this renewal.
Hmm.
You have access to market knowledge at your fingertips, literally seconds away. You have access to data. You could even do within the tools that exist today, you can do some spend analytics to help identify other spend within our portfolio. Like we have visibility at a vendor level and a contract level that you can help build some of that. So I think, you know what, it's really going to test people if they're willing to evolve.
Hmm.
I know as I build out teams, it's no longer good enough to be a transactional person. That's not real. Better be a strategic. Better understand the concepts of category management and how they apply. And because business are mandated,
Hmm.
you've got to understand the bigger picture of how it plays into the economics of company and how they perform.
I haven't ever thought about it, but this seems as such an obvious insight because AI is doing this. What you say is like an evolutionary thing, right? So you as the professional need to evolve. Like if you have been doing the business one way 5, 10 years ago, well, now with AI, you can still continue doing business the same way, but because the environment has changed so much, it's no further viable strategy. And you need to either evolve or you will be evolved
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. I think it makes it so much more interesting and to be a part of. I think it's going to accelerate. So, from my consulting experience, we had benchmarks in terms of how many engagements each sourcing person could have. And kind of staffed around those numbers. I think the depth and quality of your data improves exponentially. And I think there's a fair expectation to say the throughput should also improve for
Hmm.
procurement. So the depth that we can get to into the spend portfolio, right? You talk about, tail spend and that kind of stuff. You can get further into those things given the acceleration that these tools help us with.
Well, what I can wish to everybody that's listening or viewing this right now is use this episode as the good motivation boost. If you're in procurement right now, that's the best time for you guys to go and learn things. And thank you so much for the attention, for spending time to listen to the episode. John, you've been great. You shared so many valuable insights. If anybody of the audience would like to get in touch with you to ask any additional questions or anything else, what's the best way to reach you?
Best way to reach me, john.cornetta@comcast.net or LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. I think that is such a great platform. I've made some really good friends now, particularly as I've gone about talking more about the AI space. So lean into those conversations that I'm trying to start. And I look forward to meeting you. And Nick, thank you. Obviously, you can tell I enjoy talking about what I do. I've long had passion for it and continue to have that.
It was a pleasure, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you.